He could buy a continent and still insist the house remain perfectly quiet. Victor Almeida Costa measured life in margins and margins in silence. His mansion was a ledger written in marble and glass. Each corridor and entry he could balance with a glance. Each floor and order he kept in trim rows. Staff learned to move like a reed in wind, unseen, efficient, apologetic. He liked it this way. It made him feel safe. Then a towel fell on his chest. It happened in the kind of way ridiculous things begin. Small, absurd, and utterly decisive. The mansion, at 7 in the morning, smelled of lemon oil and the faint sweetness of roses from the conservatory. Victor had been on the terrace with his coffee, sleeves buttoned, everything aligned. He had just finished a call about a development in the south and was composing an email in his head when the scream split the ordered air. "Help! A cockroach!" The roar coming from the private wing was utterly wrong in his house. Staff froze. The butler, Ortega, clutched a silver tray like it was a shield. A panicked figure, white towel clutched to her chest, hurtled out of the doorway and collided with him as if the world had tilted. There was a wet slap of skin against suit, a muffled thud as she slid, and then, absurdly, silence. The kind of silence that happens after a small disaster, stunned and delicate. Anna lay curled on his lap, eyes wide and terrified, the towel half falling, half protecting. Victor's first thought was outrage. His second was humiliation. Hers, not his. She was on his terrace in nothing but a towel. His staff's eyes burned with embarrassment and a dozen unvoiced rules. "Get up," he said. The words were flat, practiced, ironed. He had not intended to be unkind, but his voice lived in its own armor, the way he had learned to speak when there was too much at stake. She did not move at once. Her fingers gripped the towel and she was shivering, not from the morning air, but from the kind of tremor that stayed in the body after panic. Rain in a long summer, a small quiver at the base of a song. When she looked up at him, there was nothing theatrical. There was only a person who had been surprised into being seen. "I am so sorry," she blurted. Her English was clear, with a cadence that suggested nights spent talking to herself, or to strangers on bus rides. There was a cockroach. I didn't—" "How did you get into the private wing?" Ortega demanded, voice a mix of shock and the brittle loyalty of a man who had trained himself to be invisible. "I work here," she said simply. "I just started." Victor let the towel fall. An absurdity. He had more to lose than any of them, but, in a flash, that knowledge did not contain the moment. He stood, straight as a ruler, and for a second the homeowner in him took hold, the crease of posture that had removed people before. She should be sent away. She should be fired for insubordination, for panicking, for getting in the way of the order he kept as a talisman. He had rules about private spaces. He had rules about dignity. He had rules about appearances. She burst into tears, not the small, polite disappointment of a person ashamed, but the wet, shuddering collapse of someone who had been carrying a lifetime of bad weather in a paper bag. Her shoulders trembled. Her breath came in quick pulls. Something in his chest cramped. He had not planned for that. He had planned for everything except this. Except feeling something like the hot, fierce annoyance that came with the sight of a young woman breaking down because a cockroach had sent her crashing into his life. "Sit up," he said. It was half order, half concession. Ortega moved forward, the staff forming a respectful, fumbling ring. The gardener stood at the hedges as if he had been summoned in a tableau. "Do you need anything? A towel, water?" the cook asked, hovering at the kitchen door like a concerned ant. "A towel," she whispered. "Please." They wrapped her in a spare robe. Victor could have pointed at the door and closed the ledger on the incident, but the robe made her small in an unfamiliar way, and something else, a different counting, started. He recognized a blankness in her eyes that was not surprise but exhaustion, that she had been trying to hold herself stitched together for a long time, that there had been a threadbare map under her feet for years. "I'm not well," she said into the robe. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't be. I didn't mean to come into—" "You will be dismissed," Victor said before he had time to check his tone. "You will leave." Her face went white as linen. For a second, he thought she might bolt out into the morning, towel flapping. Instead, she swallowed hard, folded herself as if she could piece together her insides and hold them. "Please," she said. The single word was fearless in its vulnerability, and there were thousands of small stories folded into it. Sleeping under park benches, an agency that had promised employment, someone who had said they'd be a housekeeper and then not told him the truth. He heard it like a plea and not like a negotiation. She was not asking him for pity. She was asking him for a pause. Victor had built a life that did not allow pauses. His childhood had taught him that pauses cost. By way of a ledger he could still feel in his hands. When his parents had died, responsibilities had moved like furniture into his life. Companies, reputations, contracts. He had learned to shape himself like a tool. He kept the estate the way one keeps a fortress. No mess, no public discord, no surprises. Surprises were expensive. He observed her then in the way he observed board presentations, line by line. Her hair was cut short and practical. Her hands had knuckles that told of work. There were traces of bruises along the forearm, old, faded, and that made a new tally in his head. She smelled faintly of antiseptic and lemons. She was young enough to hope and old enough to know the score. Most crucially, she had nothing about her that was presumptuous, and that made his annoyance less simple and more awkward, like a math problem with no single answer. "Do you have anywhere to go?" he asked. The question surprised him. It was simpler than dismissal and more complicated than keeping his distance. He had asked it because he needed to know if there was legal risk, an employee without accommodation. He had asked it and found that something inside him, an old, unwelcome softness, had reached for the right answer. Her mouth trembled. "No," she said. I was staying with a friend, but—" Her voice pinched. "She has a new job. She can't keep me. The agency, they said this job was for a woman with experience. They didn't ask me." She looked at last unshielded. There was a story there. She didn't make it a performance. Victor's business instincts, always primed, frayed. The staff looked at him, waiting for the usual gloss of command. He had options. Call security, call the agency, make a formal complaint. He had rules about household privacy that would be compromised if he did not enforce them. Yet there was a cost beyond the contract. He saw a reflection of a younger self in the way she clutched the robe. He remembered the night his father had died, how small he had felt then in a room full of decanting grief and grown men who traded condolences like currency. He remembered a woman long gone, who had cried in his mother's dressing room and who no one noticed. He had steeled himself against small things like that because they distracted from the ledger. He had become the man who could close doors and not ask what was behind them. "Stay tonight," he said abruptly. Ortega inhaled like someone who had been offered too much salt in soup. The butler's hand hovered over a tray. Silence bent. It was, by any household standard, a scandal. To house a staff member in a private suite without prior authorization. There were liability forms, background checks, reputations to consider. "Mr. Almeida Costa," Ortega said in the voice of a man who counted the correct tones for any reaction. "Sir." Victor didn't look at him. He was aware of how ridiculous his decision might be. He had not yet decided whether this was mercy, curiosity, or a strange human heuristic, an unaccountable smallness of heart. He didn't want to speak about it. He wanted to close this domestic error with a minimal wound. "You will stay in the staff wing. A bedroom will be prepared. You will be up by 6 to present yourself to Ortega. You will follow every household rule. Any failings, and you will leave first thing. Is that understood?" "Yes," she said. The relief that hit her was audible, immediate, like a wave finding a small bay. As the staff moved to make a room, Victor excused himself and walked toward his study. He had not meant to engage beyond the minimal, but the image of her, raw, startled, stayed with him. He sat in the chair that had shaped so many late nights of decision, and he thought about what kind of man let a towel fall onto him, and then didn't send a woman out into the street. He thought about the ledger of decisions that had arranged his days, and weighed this as if it were an entry, a cost, a debit, a credit. He surprised himself with another thought. If she woke in the staff wing in the dark and was cold, and found herself in this house, would she ever want to leave? The idea made his chest uncomfortable. There was no reason for personal feeling to interfere with the efficient running of a household, and yet the thought stayed as if it had become an itch he could not scratch. She slept in the staff wing, towel substituted with a spare blanket, hands clasped as if to ward off the world. Victor, in his study, made coffee, and then walked the length of the house as if to check it. A man ensuring his neighbors were quiet, his investments secure. He listened for the house's heartbeat, the wash of the fountain, the soft clatter where the cook worked, a television turned off too loud, a distant radio. He tasted the absurdity and the human urgency of his day's beginning. He thought of the ledger. He thought of the cost of pausing. He did not know that in one of the small kitchens, the cook had already given Anna an extra boiled egg. "Eat this," the woman had said, pushing the plate like an offering. "My mother used to tell me that the first thing you put into the stomach finds a way to the heart." Anna had accepted the egg with both hands and said thank you so many times that the cook's stern face softened. Little economies of warmth fit themselves into the house. That was what surprised Victor later, the staff's conspiracy of care. They had already begun to make room for her in their rituals, not because he asked, but because the house had always been a place people lived in relation to each other. He had simply forgotten that sometimes. After the towel incident and his brief awkward mercy, the day proceeded to the next scheduled items, as if nothing had happened. A meeting about a satellite purchase, a call from a client who wanted seating arrangements for a gala, the arrangement of flowers for a boardroom shelf. Victor moved through them, crisp and efficient, his mind a machine that had been disciplined to translate feeling into action. Yet he found his attention snagging on the memory of the towel and on the faint bruise at Anna's arm. That evening the agency called. Victor, efficient even when he felt complicated, dialed the number with 2 fingers on the screen. They were as surprised as he was. "A procedural error," they said. "Mislabeled applicant," they stammered. They offered apologies and an offer for reimbursement. Victor listened, long and quiet, until their words became small and insufficient. He told them nothing of Grace. She did not speak much about her past at first. She moved through the day like someone who kept her private weather in a pocket. Sometimes she hummed as she worked, melodies made for mornings, or perhaps improvised songs that patched moments. At times she became lively and talkative, offering anecdotes about a bus driver or a stray dog she'd rescued. The high energy was a bright, startling thing. Her hands moved fast as she animatedly explained how she liked to fold napkins in a way that made the table look like a bouquet. She laughed easily then, and the household's lines softened. Even Victor noticed, and his irritation became a different shade, less about order, more about the disturbance of his equilibrium. Other times the storm came in slow waves. In the pre-dawn hours when the mansion belonged to the night, and the housekeepers did their silent work, she would sit by the back stairs and breathe through old memories. She carried a small notebook in which she wrote lists. Things she needed, things she liked, coping mechanisms. No. 1. Remember to breathe, she had written in a shaky hand one night. She kept a rubber band around her wrist as if it worked. When she felt the world tilt, she snapped it against her skin to ground herself. She carried nothing showy, no perfume, no jewelry, just the toolkit of someone who had learned to live with a mind that sometimes outran her footsteps. On the 3rd morning, Victor watched her from the doorway of the library. She was at the windowsill, arranging flowers she had found in the conservatory into a mismatched vase. Her hands were efficient and tender. There was a concentration in the way she selected which stem looked right next to which. This spoke to a woman who could make small decisions into things that soothed other people. It was domestic work, but it was also art. A soft laugh escaped him at the sight. A ridiculous thing. He annoyed himself by letting a household triviality have a human consequence inside him. This was the beginning of the hazard he had always warned himself against. Small exposures lead to attachments. "Ms. Silva," he said, because addressing her by first name without permission felt like a violation but also like a small experiment. She turned. Yes, Mr. Almeida Costa? There was a polite formality in her voice that made him think of school registers and new uniforms. You may not leave the staff quarters past 11 p.m. without authorization, he said automatically, the rules returning to him like a script. The household code will be given to you. Ortega will oversee the schedule. You will have a roommate for the first week to help you acclimate. She nodded, but when she did, there was gratitude that felt like a small, private son. Thank you, she said earnestly. For the room. Do you? He paused. For a moment he considered asking what her legal name was, where she had been, what the agency had promised. The executive in him wanted to be tidy, to have records, but he was also aware of the thinness of her privacy and the depth of risk in prying. There is a background check pending. You will comply with it. Yes, she said. The word carried no defensiveness. It was, more than anything, a desire to be seen as employable, to be allowed the dignity of a clean sheet and a schedule. He almost told her to call her agency and sort this and leave it at that. Instead, he said, "Report to the pantry at noon. We will test your work with the luncheon service." It was a small command, and also a small grant of trust. She accepted it like a person who had been handed back a scrap of normal life. The luncheon was chaos in a way that made him both furious and, weirdly, fond. Anna, untrained to his particular standards but seasoned by the bristling improvisation of hardship, moved with a kind of scrappy competence. She spilled coffee on a chair and, near miraculously, removed the stain with a method the cook taught her. Vinegar, a scrub, and the stubbornness of someone who'd learned to salvage things. Victor watched as she apologized more than once for things the house did not need apologies for. She made jokes to the gardener, folded a napkin into the shape of a bird and slid it onto a child's plate like a small private rebellion. The staff laughed, sometimes at her, sometimes with her. Laughter in the house loosened the ledger's edges. During an especially hectic moment, a tray tipped, scones skittered across the marble. A toddler shrieked with delight. Victor found himself stepping out of the library with a towel in his hands. Without thinking, he intercepted a falling plate, and in the motion bumped into Anna. Their hands met on the china, an accidental contact, public plain. She looked up at him, eyes wide. And in that look there was no towel, no embarrassment, only a person who had steadied herself and then steadied him back. People who worked in high-pressure residences learned early that the employer's moods could be atmospheric. The staff whispered that he was a storm that passed. They also whispered rumors of a childhood that had hardened him, a father who kept accounts of their love, a mother who cried silently into her handkerchief. They told stories in the pantry and in the kitchen about how he had built the company from a debt and a fierce, meticulous work ethic. People assigned him a biography in hushed admiration and fear. It was, they argued, how he remained alone at night. Anna, when she was alone, would sometimes hum to herself. In the small hours, she'd sit by the back stair and touch the bruise that's been fading on her arm, as if to remember that it was not recent. She had left a room once in which the light had always turned off when someone entered. She had learned to be invisible, then to be loud, then to be still. Her mind had learned to survive by inventing small rituals. The towel incident had been one such rupture. It had been humiliating and, paradoxically, like a door swung open in a corridor she had thought walled. Victor, in the quiet of his office that night, made a list. Things to address, costs, options. He checked legal counsel contact numbers. He considered a contract of employment, a formal offer to regularize her position. He imagined the headlines, an improbable domestic scandal that would be amusing to society magazines. He imagined Raphael joking about it on the phone. "You let someone keep you awake with an incident like that?" he would tease. Raphael, his brother, had a way of turning discomfort into banter, and that thought was both a comfort and a provocation. The staff, for their part, did not merely scurry through the day's tasks and then disperse to gossip. They watched Anna as if she were a new, fragile plant dragged inside after a frost. Ortega brought her a small jar of tea. The cook walked past, and with a conspiratorial glance, told her to sleep with the window closed so the roaches would find better places. They were an odd kind of family, people bound together by the strictures of work and the softer tethers of shared living. Anna fit into their rituals as if she had always been an extra thread woven into a tablecloth. What is his story? One afternoon, the maid asked the gardener while they scrubbed the back steps, "Why is he always so precise?" "Because," the gardener said, "he thinks if he controls everything, nothing will ever surprise him. But he is wrong. The house will always surprise him." They laughed softly, and the laugh was the kind that makes a secret into a small, tender weapon. The next morning, Anna woke before dawn. The staff quarters were quiet. She had a list of things she wanted: a bed to claim, a pair of slippers in the right size, a day to earn. She made a plan. She did not intend to be rescued. She only wanted a chance to stand upright without the fear of the street at her heels. When she came down to the pantry, Victor was already there with his coffee. He rarely took his coffee in the pantry where the staff ate, and his presence there startled the rhythm. He watched her as if he had come down to test a hypothesis. She walked toward him with the quiet steadiness that belonged to people who had learned their steps. "You're early," he said. "I prefer mornings," she answered, and then added impulsively, "I like the quiet before everything breaks." He almost disapproved of her candor. Instead, he found himself smiling, a small, almost illegal movement in a face that seldom bent. The motion felt improper, like a currency exchange done without the bank's consent. "Ortega will give you your schedule," Victor said. "Do not be late." "I won't," she promised. She did not say it as a plea. She said it as a compact, a transaction of trust. Somewhere it sounded like a bargain, and bargains can be treacherous. But this one, in its small scale, felt like a place to start. If there was a rule emerging from the towel incident, it was this: a life can be rearranged by an error. Wars, fortune, love. People sized them differently. For Anna, a towel had been the lever that moved a house. For Victor, the lever was a small inconvenience that hinted at the possibility of mercy. Neither of them had yet imagined that the towel would be the first line in a story that would rewrite their definitions of home. A week passed with a rhythm that was equal parts work and social calibration. Anna proved herself steady, sometimes too steady, sometimes sweeping away crumbs like she could sweep away past mistakes. She had moments of flight when her energy rose. She would laugh and clean and rearrange the world like someone who assumed surprises could be improved. She had days when she did not leave her room for hours, when the walls seemed to press against her, and she sat with her hands in her lap, breathing through the slow tide of recollection. Victor's harshness remained, but it softened in hot little ways. He began to let things go that he would have never let go before: an unpolished plate, a misplaced cushion. He found himself listening when she hummed, and his chest lodged with a feeling he kept translating into terms he understood: responsibility. He told Ortega to file proper background checks and to create contracts that would prevent any impropriety. He wanted the world to remain respectable, even as he allowed a fault in the wall. "1 month," he told her bluntly one evening. "We will classify this as a probation period. If you are competent, you'll be offered a permanent position. If not, you will leave." She smiled, a weary, grateful smile. 1 month, she echoed. The words wrapped like a promise. There were moments between then and what would become the true turning points. A dinner where she accidentally served the wrong wine, and laughed so hard that he found himself laughing too. An evening when Ortega told a story about a lost cat, and she offered to go look for it in the rose garden. A time when she found a sun-spotted patch on the study's carpet, and sat in it like a child, savoring the warmth. Victor watched these moments like an accountant watching his books for anomalies, details that did not match the narrative he had told himself about solitude and control. Anna, in turn, watched him. She noticed the little ways he defied his reputation, the way he paused by the photograph of a woman she guessed must be his mother, the way his hands trembled slightly when he read a letter. She saw, perhaps with a kind of audacity only survival breeds, that his iron had been hammered thin in places. She filed these observations away like small treasures, not because she wanted to exploit them, but because people who had been invisible long enough recognized the shapes of loneliness when they saw them. On a rain-swept afternoon, as thunder walked the city like a stroller, Victor found her in the laundry room. She was kneeling by a basket, folding linens with such care that even the most exacting guest would have praised the creases. She looked up at him, cheeks flushed with work, and said quietly, "You don't have to be so afraid of mess." The sentence struck him like cold water. He realized that the house had been built to keep out not just dirt, but messiness of any kind, of relationships, grief, carelessness. He had been so busy keeping room that he had forgotten what it meant to live in it. "Neither do you," he said before he knew he would. She blinked. For a moment she seemed to search for the joke, and without finding one, accepted the earnestness. She laughed then, a small, luminous sound, and for reasons he could not entirely name, he offered her a piece of advice not about linens, but about life. "Learn to fold the corners inward," he said. "It makes everything look cleaner." "That's the first life advice you've given me," she said. "I will hold on to it." And so it went. The house lived on in its rituals. People did what they did. Victor kept his ledger, Anna kept hers. The towel incident became a syllable in their lives, a thing they could reference like a notch in a wall. It had not yet become the sentence. In the edges of that folded week, Victor started to find himself sitting by the terrace at night, listening for the small sound of her humming as she moved through the rooms. He told himself he was being efficient, observing staff, checking that processes were adequate. He told himself it was impossible to be anything else. A man of his training could not admit to being interested in such frivolities. But interest is a small topic with a large appetite. It grows like moss. It quietly moves in the cracks. He had no defense against this, because it required no open invitation. It only needed the opening of a towel and the bravery of a woman to look up, human and trembling, and ask for a place to rest. One night in the staff quarters, she wrote a list she would not show anyone. No. 1, keep job. No. 2, save money. No. 3, find a small room where the landlord doesn't knock too early. Her list was practical. It was not a demand that he change his life. It was a map for herself. She slept with the robe as a shield and woke with the sun as a promise. Victor, days later, would find himself thinking of nothing else, and he would call it by a business term, an investment. But for now, in these quiet days after the towel fell and after the apology and after the night's slant of mercy, it was simply a nuisance, a persistent, inexplicable softening. The house continued. The staff buzzed with the small conspiracies of people who lived together, who saw who coming in late, who murmured about the eccentricities of the owner, who offered a plate of food when someone was tired. The towel incident became a story told in whispers and in jokes, and in the occasional cringe. The contract was being written. Ortega made lists. The cook taught Anna a new method of making flan that made the kitchen smell like caramel in memory. When the day came for Victor to meet with the legal team about formalizing employment, he did so with his usual meticulousness. Contracts were read, clauses inserted, a probationary period, a confidentiality statement, a clause about conduct in private spaces, an indemnity clause for anything the house might require. He did not sign anything in front of her. He had his reasons, practical, reputational, but he also knew that private things stayed private if one kept them that way. Anna, oblivious to the legal weight of what was being prepared, sat in the pantry and made a sandwich. She observed him sometimes like a human complex machine that produced silence instead of sound. He was part of her new weather. She learned how to place dishes so that they made the least clatter. She learned how to set the table in a way that asked for nothing. She learned how to breathe when the house's moods were stormy. On the last night of the week, as rain beat the conservatory glass and the fountain made its own gentle critique, Victor stood on the terrace with his hands in his pockets and watched Anna through the window. There she was, arranging napkins into little boats. She looked entirely ordinary, the sort of ordinariness that was a miracle when measured against a life that had been rough and wandering. He felt a strange sensation, as if the house had a new furniture in it that he had not ordered and could not return. He decided then to keep her on. Not out of charity. He would have hated to think of it in such mawkish terms, but because the ledger that guided him had become unbalanced in a small human way. It required a correction. He would call it calculation then. He would call it prudence. He didn't know then what the towel had truly done. He didn't know that a negligence of civility could create a space for affection. For now, it was an anomaly to be managed, a person to be scheduled, a small human story in a house that kept its stories behind locked doors. Outside, thunder softened with the night. Inside, Anna hummed, unaware that a decision had been made that would alter the ledger of two lives. Somewhere in the house, a towel lay folded on a spare armchair, benign and ordinary, ready to be used for its proper purpose or to remind them both that life sometimes happens in accidental falls. The week after the rain that softened the terrace passed like a slow unraveling. Small things kept happening, an extra cup left on the side table, a cushion misplaced and then restored, a child's drawing pinned to the staff notice board. That made Victor aware, with an odd constancy, that the house no longer obeyed him with absolute silence. He found this both irritating and, in a way he would not admit to anyone, alive. It was Raphael who announced his arrival like a trumpet. He walked into the kitchen one bright morning, carrying 2 steaming paper cups and a grin that could have smoothed out the sternest accountant's ledgers. The brothers looked like deliberate contradictions. Identical at first glance, same dark hair, same jawline, but Raphael's shoulders relaxed in an invitation, while Victor's remained a fortress. "Who gave you permission to import joy?" Victor said before he could stop himself. Raphael set a cup in front of Anna, as if he had always been in the business of setting people at ease. "Permission is overrated. Besides, I heard about the towel. I didn't want to miss the origin story." Anna, who had been arranging pastries with the intensity of a person who could make order from crumbs, blushed, and then laughed. The sound ricocheted in the kitchen. It was as if she had thrown a pebble, and the whole house had taken notice. Raphael's presence eased the staff in a way Victor's never could. He listened to jokes, offered a repartee to the cook, teased Ortega in a way that left the butler smiling and slightly scandalized. He was all warmth, the kind of person who could make a late evening feel like a party, merely by walking into the room. He also watched Anna with something that was not only curiosity. The way he lingered at the pantry door while she told a story about a bus driver who had once given away the newsprint because a stray dog needed bedding felt like a man cataloging goodness in real time. He did not flirt with cruelty. His interest was plain and earnest. For Anna, this was both flattering and unsettling. She had long since learned that attention could be a currency and that it could be spent badly. Victor noticed Raphael's regard and hated it. Not because he imagined a serious rival. Raphael was too different in temperament to be a mirror in the ledger. But because the feelings Raphael awakened in him were complicated and ugly in their own way. Jealousy was a small animal that gnawed at the back of his throat the way a poorly filed receipt can eat at a balance sheet. Every laugh shared between Anna and Raphael felt to Victor like a tiny miscalculation. He chastised himself, logically. Jealousy of a newcomer was irrational. Their house had rules. He had rules. He had no permission for distractions. Raphael, to his credit, was not a man of cruel games. If he sensed Victor's tightening, he treated it like something to soothe rather than provoke. He would clap Victor on the shoulder and say, "Relax, brother. She's your storm to weather, if you insist on keeping score." What Raphael could not see, at least at first, were the private mechanics of Victor's attention. Victor had never been allowed, as a child, the indulgence of temperament. He had learned to reduce everything into decisions. Wound-up feelings were liabilities. Now, in the slow mornings, he found himself cataloging where Anna placed the spoons, the way she smoothed a tablecloth with a ritual that made the edges align like tidy accounts. He could not explain why such small gestures lodged under his stern skin. He tried to call it efficiency, but efficiency didn't bring a hollowed-out ache to the chest when she left the pantry humming. Anna, for her part, was grateful for Raphael's easy warmth. It felt like a sunlight that did not expect payment. He seemed to understand jokes, to appreciate the way she made small things feel like acts of defiance. She enjoyed the company without thinking long about the consequence of enjoyment. She had been schooled by scarcity into taking good things as if they were leavings, careful not to expect a banquet to arrive twice. Her life before the house lived in the corners of her mind like faint wallpaper. She had been a child who learned to recognize the sound of doors closing, practiced the art of not making noise, steps like soft punctuation. She had survived nights where bills were whispered like threats, where the promise of shelter was thin as tissue paper. There were bruises on her arms from a time she had been younger and unsafe, and there were lists she kept in a small notebook. Practical lists, not confessions. They were anchors. When nights were heavy, she wrote, Number 1, breathe. Number 2, find a bed. Number 3, keep promises to yourself. Those lists changed subtly after the towel. They became a different kind of map. She practiced small freedoms, sitting by the conservatory at dusk and letting the scent of roses fill her lungs, making a pot of tea and not drinking it too quickly. She learned the house's rhythms and, when she was brave, the ways to ask for more. Raphael watched her with a patience that had nothing to do with possession. You have a laugh that makes the floors want to be walked on, he told her one afternoon, which made her blush exactly as he'd predicted. He wasn't trying to corner her. He simply enjoyed the effect she had on people, fascinated by how someone could be at once fragile and determined. In the way he looked at her, she read no calculation, only a desire to know someone wholly. Victor misread it. He read affection as a threat. He watched them together, and the image of Raphael hosting her like a guest in his world made something inside him close like a vault. The irony was not lost on him. He had built his life around ownership and dispassion, and yet he now felt deeply and without a ledger to account for it. The pool rescue altered everything. It began, in truth, with a careless joke and a slice of long afternoon heat. The household had been hosting a small family lunch for Raphael's arrival. Sandwiches and flan, laughter around the dining table, a toddler with jam on his fingers. After the meal, some of the staff took a moment to rest. Anna, who was rarely idle, found herself drawn to the pool's glassy sheen, where the afternoon sun turned the water into a slice of sky at hand. She dipped a toe in, then the back of her hand, and then sat on the tiled step, dangling her legs. There were ripples. There was the sound of distant thunder. It was a small luxury, a private permission. A patronizing guest, one of the clients Victor had invited that day to see house renovations, made an offhand, flippant remark about people in service taking liberties. He did not know Anna's name. He only saw a worker, uniformed, smiling in a way that suggested she had been taught to. The remark landed awkwardly in Anna's ears. It smelled of the same disregard she had known all her life. She stood abruptly at the edge of the pool to leave and misjudged the tile. It was a small slip, a slick patch, a misaligned step, but the motion unspooled into something larger. Her foot slid, she flailed, arms pinwheeling, hair flying. For a second she was a contained panic, the kind that might settle with a laugh. Then a cramp seized her thigh, a legacy of nights hurried and cold, and she went under. The house reacted in a single scattered moment. Someone screamed. A child's wail rose. The man who'd made the insult looked stunned, as if seeing the life he had diminished for the first time when it mattered. Raphael dove without thought. Victor didn't. He moved with the precise, measured speed of habit, but he moved. Time, in that instance, curved. Victor, who had always kept distance, tensed into a different architecture of body, one built for action, not evasion. He dove in with the flat, efficient strokes of someone who knew how to engineer solutions. The water closed around them like a cool sheet. Someone, Raphael or the gardener, threw down a towel. Ortega shouted instructions, which no one heard because the world had narrowed to the two of them in the pool and the near vertical edge of the world beyond. Victor found her beneath the surface, the hair a dark cloud around her face. He grabbed her shoulder, felt the slickness of the fabric against his palm, and pulled. Her eyes were wide and wild in the way of someone who had crashed into an old fear. She coughed up water when his arm wrapped around her. He hauled her to the edge, the two of them breathing like people who had run for miles. He helped her sit, wrapped her in a towel that smelled of citrus and bleach, and watched as she trembled with more than cold. She looked at him then, and for a suspended moment, vulnerability and anger and humiliation warred on her face. "I'm fine," she tried to say, voice raw. "You aren't fine," he said, and the precise timbre in his voice, usually iron, broke into something rough and immediate. He was not thinking of consequence. He was thinking of her heartbeat under his palm, the thinness of her shoulders. He wanted oddly and irrevocably to keep her from being small. Raphael, who had been beside them, folded back his swim trunks and looked between them like someone who had just witnessed a revelation. "You two are," he began, and then stopped because none of the standard words fit. The rescue lit a torch in the house's gossip circuit. The staff turned the event into a story of heroics and clumsiness. Victor the iceberg who had lurched to rescue. Raphael the athletic brother who had lunged without thinking. Anna, the woman who made everyone watch the way a life almost slipped and then did not. The incident moved through the rooms like a rumor that changed pitch with each telling. For Victor, the pool was an incision into the day. He saw how small the world could be when it shrank down to the need to save someone. He could write plans for construction and the prosecution of deals in neat columns, but he could not draft the calculus of the way his chest hurt with relief, and something like tenderness, when Anna coughed and clutched the towel. Anna, wrapped in a robe in the staff room, felt ashamed and strangely seen. The crash into water was a collision with an old list of fears and the sense of being unmoored. But in the minutes after, when Victor sat by her shoulder with a quietness that was less a command and more a presence, she felt less alone. He spoke infrequently, practical instructions, then a quietness that gave her permission to be shivering and not composed. "Stay out of the pool," he said, and there was a note not of order but of something like care. It was small. It was a start. That night, while the house settled into a hush, Victor found himself standing by the terrace watching the sky. He kept telling himself the rescue had been his responsibility, an impulse to be efficient and correct errors. He was not ready to admit that it had touched something in him he had not budgeted for. Raphael, seeing them, grew bluntly honest. He cornered Victor in the library, leaned on the veneer of the desk and said, "You like her?" Victor bristled. "I am a man who runs companies," he said. "I am not. This is irrelevant." Raphael chuckled. "Say it like you mean it. You like her, you protect her like she is part of your balance sheet, and you are invested." "I am not invested," Victor said, more sharply than he intended. "You are," Raphael said. "And if you don't do something with that, if you don't say anything, offer something concrete, then the universe will hand you outcomes you didn't approve of." Raphael's candor was not malicious. It was a prod. It was the sort of challenge a brother issues to wake a man from the sleep of diplomacy. "You have 24 hours to say what you mean, or I will," Raphael said, with an impishness that made Victor feel both threatened and oddly amused. This was the 24-hour ultimatum referenced in the house for days afterward. Raphael, who could have made the moment about a competition, was simply trying to nudge Victor into honesty. He saw in Anna something beautiful, and did not want to be the cause of another man living a life of regrets. He wanted to jolt Victor into movement. Victor, to his credit and slight horror, recognized the truth of Raphael's observation. He sat with the decision like a lawyer with a case file. He weighed options: confess, courtship, or retreat. Confession in private would have been tidy, perhaps, a phone call and an offer. But he knew intimacy could not be an afterthought. If he was to pursue Anna, he needed to do it in a way that recognized the power imbalance and gave her agency. So he did what was both logical and reckless. He asked her out. Not to a date in the way of a patron or a man with a checkbook, but to a dinner where he would have to listen and speak as an equal. "Will you have dinner with me?" he asked one evening in the pantry where they had both found a moment of quiet. There were stacks of linen, a faint smell of citrus, and the hush of the house doing what houses do when secrets are being made polite. Anna blinked. She had not expected an offer. She had not expected any man of his station to ask her to dinner as if she were not a subordinate. That the offer came with a question and not a command made it feel precarious and precious. "Do you mean," she began, and then swallowed and said, "Yes." She did not say yes because she imagined a life as his romantic fantasy. She said yes for the simple reason that she wanted to know the man who had rescued her from the pool and offered her a bed. She said yes because curiosity is a brave thing. She said yes because she wanted to practice saying yes to things that did not come with strings. Their dinner was a study in discomfort and curiosity. Victor had ordered a small, unostentatious meal. He wanted the conversation to be the currency. They talked, awkwardly at first, about trivial things. She told him about the way she learned to fold napkins into birds. He told her about his father's ledger that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco. He was clumsy at vulnerability, but his attempts were real. She was candid about lists and nights under shelterless skies without letting them be his burden to solve. There was laughter. There was an odd intimacy to telling each other small things. After dinner, as the house turned quiet, they walked the terrace. The city beyond the garden gleamed. He stopped by a lamppost and turned to her. "I like you," he said without fanfare. The confession was not wrapped in melodrama. It simply landed. "I like you too," Anna said, because whatever else she felt had lodged in her and found a resonance. Their mouths met then, not in the desperate way of lonely people grabbing for solace, but in a deliberate, mutual decision. He cupped her cheek and waited as if a permission slip had to be signed by both hearts. She leaned in. Her hands found his sleeve, then his wrist. The kiss was long enough to count as a beginning, and short enough to recognize they were stepping into a territory that required maps. They did not sleep together that night. They discussed, with the bluntness of people who had learned the necessity of naming things, what this meant. They spoke about the power imbalance, about how a man who employed her could not ask for everything without offering structural change. Victor listened, and then surprised himself by proposing a plan that was more than romantic rhetoric. "I will formalize your position," he said. "A written contract, fair salary, and the option for you to take classes or training. Ortega will not be your direct report. I will appoint a manager who reports to me. If at any point you feel uncomfortable, you can leave or change roles without penalty." Anna sat with the words. They were not grand declarations, but they were practical things that mattered. He spoke like a man who loved the world of contracts, using terms and clauses with tenderness. She accepted his proposal to structure the relationship because she was wary of dependence. She wanted to be sure that love, if it grew, would not be built on the shaky scaffolding of her needing a job to survive. The couple agreed to go slowly, to not hide their relationship, and to involve Ortega and the staff in a transparent way. There were minor protests from some quarters. The society magazines would have had a scandal if they had found Spleen with enough curiosity, but Victor handled the details with his usual meticulousness. He arranged for a formal employment contract. Ortega, after an initial fuss about procedure, proved unexpectedly supportive. He had his own quiet code of fairness and admired anyone who could manage dignity in a house of transactions. Raphael watched these developments and felt both triumphant and defeated. He had no wish to win by default. He wanted a friend to be happy. When he realized that Victor's confessions were not theatrical gestures but the building blocks of a lasting decision, he stepped back with grace. He remained a bright presence in their lives, teasing, loving, an occasional instigator of absurdity, and in time became the godfather of their first child. The rhythm of their relationship was not romanticized. There were temperamental storms. Anna, who had bipolar tendencies, had episodes that required understanding and practical coping mechanisms. Victor did not save her from her condition, because he could not, and because that would have been a form of charity that stripped her of agency. Instead, he learned ways to support her that respected her autonomy. He attended a counselor with her when she invited him, sat through a conversation with a doctor about sleep hygiene and the importance of medication adherence, and learned the signs of an approaching episode. When she stopped sleeping, when her speech sped up into strings of ideas that did not land, when she flicked her fingers as if the world were turning too quickly, There was a scandal one month, small, crude, when a guest misconstrued a private moment and a photo made its way to a tabloid. The story ran with sensationalist headlines about the billionaire and his maid. Victor's instincts were to sue, to silence, to isolate. Anna's instinct was embarrassment and a flash of anger. She insisted on speaking at the staff meeting. Her voice was steady. "I work here," she said, "but I am not a spectacle. I am a person." Victor watched her stand up for herself and felt a fierce pride swell like a heat. He had not known how to feel pride before in someone else's courage. He moved quickly to clarify roles, to issue a public note about relationships at the house that had the crispness of legalese. But beneath the file-stamped formality, there was a deliberate human decision. He would not allow his power to be used to silence or to coerce. He would be accountable. A pivotal night came 2 months later when everything they had been careful about collided with the rawness of feeling. Anna had a bad episode, intense anxiety amplified by a sleepless tear. She left the house in the small hours, tears and breath jerking in the dark like a trapped animal. She walked the city streets until her legs felt like aching hinges. Victor found her on a bench by the river when the tide was almost black, and the city lights reflected like trapped stars. "Why didn't you call?" he asked. "I didn't want to bother you," she said. Her voice trembled, not different from that night with the towel, but steeled by months of trying. He sat beside her and did something he'd rarely done. He apologized. "I'm sorry. I should have made it simpler for you to ask for help. I should have a plan, not have it feel like you are intruding." She looked at him then, and the tone of the world shifted. It was a small change in syntax, an admission of failing where he would have once guarded his dignity with silence. "I don't want you to fix me," she said. "I want you to be someone I can say I need." He took her hand. "Then tell me," he said, "and I will be here." They walked back to the house hand in hand, not secretive, but deliberate. The staff found them on the terrace, 2 silhouettes against the night, and no one gasped. People breathed. The house had reassembled. The pressure from the outside world never fully vanished. There were whispers, a few stares at lunch, and the occasional careless comment from a client who thought status could grant them entitlement. But Victor's measures, contracts, delegation, transparency, reminded everyone that this was not a trivial affair. He had rendered his affection into policy and promises. He did not simply announce he loved her. He acted to ensure she could be safe within the structure of his world. The midnight kiss happened differently this time. It was not a furtive thing. It was an agreed-upon surrender after a long evening of conversation about the future. They had been in the library, speaking about children in the abstract because both had had an image of family in their minds at different frequencies. Victor's measured, Anna's possibility studied. She had said she sometimes feared being the sort of person who could not stay, and he had said he feared being the sort of man who prioritized control above tenderness. "Promise me you'll tell me when the storm is coming," she said, fingers lacing around the spine of a book. "I promise," he replied and leaned in, and she leaned closer. This time there was no anxiety about roles or power, only an agreement. "May I kiss you?" he asked, not because he needed permission from an unequal position, but because he wanted to practice asking. "Yes," she said. The yes tethered them in a way that was both ordinary and sacred. Their kiss was the kind that finally allowed the world to catch up to the feeling that had been building like a quiet pressure. It was an admission and a promise, and when they separated there was laughter, soft, unafraid, because both had been brave enough to name what was happening, and honest enough to set boundaries. The stakes shifted when Raphael, misreading his own feelings for a heartbeat of selfishness, invited Anna to a weekend away with a group of friends. He was trying to nudge Victor into action, and also testing the water for his own affection. But when Anna returned, gentle, amused, and grateful for the respite, Raphael realized the truth. He wanted his brother to be happy more than he wanted anything else. One late afternoon, Victor organized a small party. Staff, a few longtime friends, Ortega's chosen invitees. He intended it to be a casual celebration of the household season, a successful charity dinner, a project wrapped up, a personal milestone. He asked Anna to be his partner in hosting, an act that declared their relationship publicly in a way his contracts and memos could not. When the party swelled into soft conversations and clinking glasses, Victor stepped to the center of the terrace and, with his heart pacing like someone unaccustomed to this particular risk, spoke. He did not make a grand spectacle of his proposal. He did not choose a crestfallen stage that begged for applause. He chose instead to speak plainly. "Anna," he said, and the name in his mouth was careful and exact, a name he had not said often in intimacy, but used now with the weight of intention. "You grew up thinking the world would not make room for you. I grew up thinking I could make room by closing everything else out. I am tired of walls." She looked at him with the same blend of humor and wonder that had marked their first moments. "What are you saying?" she asked, though she knew in the way one might know a sky is about to rain. He knelt, not theatrically, but as a man lowering himself to be level. He produced a small, simple ring that sat like a promise rather than a proclamation. "Will you marry me?" he asked. It was a question wrapped in practicality as much as romance. He offered not only his heart but an array of systems he'd reworked, a formal path to end their employer-employee dynamic if they married, a plan to ensure she could keep her autonomy, a promise to be accountable publicly and privately. The silence that followed was warm and full. She took his hand and then, with a smile that carried the memory of a towel and a pool and 1,000 small negotiations, she said, "Yes." The house did not erupt with champagne as in films. Instead, Ortega clapped in a way that was half proper and half maternal. The cook produced an extra flan. Raphael whooped like a good uncle, then hugged them both. The staff gathered, laughing and crying and sharing the kind of affection born from years of shared chores and secrets. It was noisy, honest, and sanctified by the ordinary, the sound of a tray being set down, the smell of caramel and lemon, the clatter of spoons. They did not rush into a fairy tale. There were long conversations with lawyers and with HR. Victor arranged for Anna to become a contracted employee, with a salary that matched governance norms. They agreed that, if married, he would not be her direct supervisor. He set up an educational fund for her to pursue culinary classes if she wished, or any training she chose. They also found a new home, less an exile from his world than a stage for a life they would shape together. That negotiation required speeches, signatures, and compromises. It required that he publicly take the risk of being judged, and she privately face the terror of losing independence for something else. On the day they married, it was not the society page that bathed them in light, but the small corridor of family and staff and a few friends who meant the most. Anna walked down a makeshift aisle in the conservatory with flowers pinned to her hair, and Victor was there, beating back a reflection of nerves with a faint and real grin. Raphael was his best man, and Ortega officiated in a way only a man who had been the house's quiet conscience could. They promised each other things quiet and fierce, to listen, to intervene when one of them faltered, to never let the other be turned into a caricature. They promised to examine power in their home, and to adjust for fairness. It was not all poetry. There were practical vows about sleeping arrangements and making sure each had time alone. But there was a real tenderness that made the practical vows feel a sacrament. The years that followed were not spotless. There were times when Anna's condition required adjustments. She took medication with care, attended therapy where she learned to recognize triggers and use coping strategies, and lived with the knowledge that sometimes storms arrive uninvited. Victor learned to distribute responsibility and to defer to professionals who could advise better than he could. They did not romanticize the difficulty. They faced it. Doctor visits scheduled in the calendar, nights where one or both did not sleep, apologies and conversations where power had to be negotiated not once but repeatedly. Their family grew in a way that felt like the folding of a tablecloth. Gradual, careful, and then suddenly there was a dinner that would not seat everyone. First came Marina, who arrived with a loud, blinking determination. She inherited Anna's laugh and Raphael's propensity for mischief. Then Lucas, quiet and observant, who favored Victor's brow and his capacity for stoic tenderness. Finally, Daniel, with a head of curls and a penchant for leaving towels in strategic places that made the household laugh and groan in equal measure. The staff remained a tapestry. Ortega retired eventually to a quiet house by the sea, but attended every family gathering like an honorary patriarch. The cook taught Marina how to make flan, and Lucas how to stop before stepping into a puddle. The gardener became a godsend when the children's energy threatened to flatten the roses. Raphael lived nearby and dropped in with the kind of frequency that demonstrated he was family by choice, as well as by blood. He taught the children to whistle in a way that bordered on the mischievous. There were domestic scenes that could be read as trivial and yet, for them, were small epiphanies. A spilled cup of coffee on a Sunday morning led to laughter and a playful scolding that felt like forgiveness. A puddle of bath water that sloshed across the tile sent the children into fits of giggles, and Victor into a complicit grin. Baby bottles, homework, PTA meetings. These ordinary obligations knit them together more securely than vows. The towel incident remained a private joke and a mythic origin. On lazy Saturday mornings, Marina would wrap herself in a giant towel and run across the terrace, shrieking with the sense that she was reenacting history. Victor would pretend outrage, Raphael would stage a mock faint, and Anna would brace herself and then catch Marina in a hug that smelled faintly of lemon and flan. They would laugh until they could not breathe. At one point, when the family sat at a chaotic dinner and someone, usually Daniel, dropped a towel in a dramatic flourish, Raphael commented, "Who would have thought a towel could have such power?" Victor looked across at Anna, who, with a small smudge of jam on her cheek, smiled like the woman who had once been seen naked on his terrace and then saved from a pool. He reached for her hand under the table and squeezed. In that simple squeeze was a ledger settled not in money but in moments, apologies paid, boundaries discussed, and an account balanced with the interest of laughter. They had not erased the disparities of their beginnings. They had, instead, made choices that redistributed them. Anna remained stubbornly independent. She took classes at the community culinary school, and later opened a modest weekend baking stall that she ran with the pride of someone who could build. Victor learned to let people be, to accept that control was a poor substitute for intimacy. Raphael continued to be both a fracture and a balm, the unpredictable wind that kept them from calcifying. Years later, looking at their 3 children tumbling across the terrace with a towel battle that would have seemed absurd on paper, Victor understood the truth that had been incubating all along. Love did not solve everything, but it made the world more habitable. It taught him to make margins where there had been none, to allow for the messy arithmetic of human lives. He had not purchased this contentment. He had earned it in conversations, apologies, small acts of courage, and contractual changes that protected dignity. On quiet nights, when the house finally slept and only the fountain whispered, he would sometimes find himself in the library, thumbing through the ledger of his life not for figures but for days he had been brave in the small things. He would turn to the page of the towel and smile in a way that told him the rightness of life's peculiar mercies. Anna, who had once packed lists into a notebook as if they were emergency supplies, kept a different kind of inventory now. A memory box with a small piece of the towel folded inside it beneath a velvet ribbon. It was not about clinging to the past. It was about remembering how small accidents could have enormous consequences. She would sometimes take it out and run her fingers over the fabric, and then fold it back carefully, a relic of an improbable beginning. Their relationship, like any lived life, held storms. There were nights of worry, nights when a child's fever kept them awake, nights when Anna's mood swung and she needed a firm hand and gentleness in equal parts. There were also evenings of blistering laughter around a kitchen table, of Raphael playing ridiculous songs for the kids, of Ortega calling from the coast to report on the state of his garden. The final familiarity of the house was its capacity to be both a workplace and a home, a place where rules coexisted with mercy. They had managed to create a life that made space for imperfection and for safety. They made choices with intention, to be transparent about their relationship, to remove structural injustices where they could, and to commit to a partnership that did not smother the other's right to be whole. On a late spring afternoon some 5 years after the original towel incident, the children, Marina with a crown of daisies in her hair, Lucas carrying a battered soccer ball, Daniel trailing a towel like a cape, sat in a disorderly ring on the terrace while Raphael recounted, with the theatricality of an uncle, the story of how their parents had met. Victor and Anna listened from the shade, hands intertwined without theatricality. They were older, patient, and imprinted with the minor scars of living. "And what about the towel?" Marina demanded, because children always ask for the dramatic flourish. Raphael, not missing a beat, made eyes at Victor. "Ah, the towel," he said. "Legend has it that the towel was a trap set by the gods to bring them together." Victor rolled his eyes in a practiced, amused way. "It was a towel," he said. "It was the best towel," Anna corrected solemnly. "Found in the linen closet labeled spare, certainly heroic." They laughed, the sound a warm, unpretentious chorus. The house held them in its familiar patterns, a kettle on a low boil, a flan cooling in the window, the gardener sweeping a path. Outside, the city continued in its mixture of indifference and bustle. Inside, a family argued for, and against, the proper placement of a towel in ritual and story. When the sun tilted and the children ran to upend their small private world into evening bathwater and bedtime stories, Victor felt the peculiar, startling sense of being less rigid. He had learned how to keep a ledger for business and a different kind of account for love, one that measured investments in laughter, in care, and in the deliberate labor of shared days. He looked at Anna, who was tying a towel around Daniel like a cape, and he thought of how brief a moment could be the hinge on which a life turns. He remembered the sound of her first scream on the terrace, the way she had fallen into him with a towel useful as modesty and as omen. He saw their children making a mess of the same terrace that had once been a domain of strict rules, and he felt, finally and without pretense, that his life had been corrected by a simple, absurd accident. The world had taught him many things, but most of all it had taught him to make room. He had learned to balance ledgers not with the narrow aim of control, but with the wider includes of mercy. Later, when the children were tucked into bed and the night closed soft and forgiving, Victor and Anna sat in the darkened kitchen, the kettle long cooled and the house deep in its breathing. They held hands, thumb playing with thumb, the texture of daily life firm and ordinary between them. "Remember the first time you saw me?" Anna asked softly. He smiled. "You were wrapped in a towel," he said. "And you were not kind," she teased. "Kindness takes time," he said. "So does honesty." "We had both," she replied. "In the end." On the shelf, a folded towel waited, a relic and a joke. It had belonged to the chain of small events that unspooled into a life. They had refused to let shame be the last chapter. Instead, they used it as a hinge, a way to open the house into something livable. The story, if it had a moral, was not that grand gestures or wealth could fix loneliness. It was that people could choose again and again to be accountable and tender. It was that a towel could fall and, in the falling, offer an invitation. It was that a man who kept ledgers could learn to keep a life. If this little history wanted anything more, Raphael would deliver it with a wink and a flan. Ortega would insist that the proper thing to do was to respect privacy. The children would invent new legends, and they would live, imperfect and delightful, with towels perpetually underfoot. If you enjoyed this messy, heartwarming romance, please like and subscribe for more stories that celebrate imperfect beginnings and the deliberate labor of love.